Hamitake pi petikile me chante ta wogla ke hanape choose uplo. Steve Tamayo macha uplo. Macha si chango Lakota. Hello, boys and girls. My name is Steve Tamayo. I'm a member of the Rosebud Sioux tribe from Rosebud, South Dakota. I come from the lands of the Burnt Dye people in Rosebud, South Dakota. And so I wanted to share some of our stories from the Lakota Nation with you. The indigenous tribes of the Western Hemisphere have always understood our connection to the stars. The stories of our existence have been interwoven into our creation stories and have been passed down for the next generation to abide by. As our relatives descended from the skies, the shape of the turtle was the first image embedded into their minds. This was the information that was gifted to the elders. We have specific obligations for protecting the land, the water, and the plants on Grandmother Earth that we call Uchimaka. This was an agreement made long ago. This was made during one of the events in our Lakota Creation stories called the Great Race that took place in the Black Hills. And so from aerial satellites, you can actually see the red ring that still exists around the Black Hills because of the blood that was spilled during this great race. Indigenous nations have had a simple yet very powerful understanding of land acknowledgement, a unique relationship that exists with our traditional territories across Turtle Island. Tribes have been diligently working with the historical trauma and intergenerational trauma to untangle the historical knots of colonialism, all the while still standing up for our relatives on Turtle Island. And so we believe as Lakota people, as indigenous people of Uchimaka, of Grandmother Earth, that we are actually Star Nation people. Long ago, in one of our creation stories, before we emerged from the underworld, there was this relative that we call Ikdom. Ikdom is the spider. And so all indigenous people, all indigenous nations on Turtle Island, we have tricksters. And so the tricksters are the ones that transform. And so they thrive on misery. And so one of the tricksters for the Lakotas, once again, is the spider. It's Ikdom. And so long ago, before we made our ways to the land, up on the Earth's surface, we lived in the underworld. And so Ikdom made his way in what we call the breathing hole of Wind Cave in the Black Hills. And so Ikdom traveled down and he asked some of the people down in the underworld to come on out and to experience life on the surface, on the land surface. And so everybody's like, no, we were told never to go to the land surface. And so, of course, there was this guy, this individual who never listened. And so the trickster, he caught his interest. And so he's like, come on, you're going to enjoy this. You're really going to like this. And so this young man's like, okay, yeah, I'm adventurous. I don't like being in the underworld. I want to go exploring. I want to see what else is out there. And so he went with Dikdom. And so when he made his way to the Earth's surface, he was renamed Tokahe. And Tokahe is the first being. And so the first being made his way from the underworld up once again onto the land surface. And so when Ikdom brought him up onto the land surface, they dressed him in all their finery. And so all of the deers and the buffalo, they gave up some of their hides to make clothing and to cover this individual that became known as Tokahe. And so they decorated it with the best paint pigments and with the best quill work that they could donate from the porcupines. And so once again, there's a collaboration of the plant world and the four-leggeds and the winged relative, and they dressed Tokahe to their finest. And so then they gifted him with food and all the fineries that once again that existed. And so after he feasted and after he spent this time in leisure up on the land surface, he made his way back down into the underworld to tell all of his other relatives. He's like, you are not going to believe what I just experienced. And so he wanted them to go up to the land surface with them. And so finally, a whole bunch of people was like, okay, we we agree with you. We want to go see what's up on the land. And so they made their ways through the caverns and the caves of the Black Hills. And so when they got onto the land surface, the spider, he just started laughing and laughing, and he fell on his back, and he was rubbing his belly, and he just kept laughing at the two-legged people that he brought from the underworld, because he closed up the hole at Wind Cave. And so from that time on, the people could never go back down into the underworld. And so then he brought in the harsh winters of the plains, of the Rocky Mountains, of the Black Hills. And so here comes all the snow and the blizzards, and then the famine was brought on, and all of the relatives that fed Tokay all ran away. And so the people had to starve. They had to endure all the hardships that they feared. And so once again, the spider, Dome, just laid on his back, and he just kept laughing and laughing at the misery of people that he was able to bring upon the people. And so understanding that there was this great race that took place. And so understanding that great race, everybody wanted to control the earth and control the world. And so in doing so, they decided to ask the creator. They're like, who are you going to make in charge of everything and everybody on this earth's surface? And so the creator looked down upon them, and he's like, it's for you guys to figure it out. And so they're like, you have to figure out some way to figure out who's going to be in charge of everything on the earth. And so they all agreed. They're like, well, let's have a race. Let's run around the Black Hills. And so they all agreed, and they took off, all the four-legged, all the winged relative, all the relatives who live in the underworld, all the worms and caterpillars and everybody. And so they started running and started racing. And so they raced and raced and raced for days and days and days. And so they raced until their blood started pouring out of their feet, because it was wearing through their skin. And so when we look at the imagery of this racetrack that exists around the Black Hills, there's a red ring because all of the blood that was spilled. And so understanding that, it was coming to an end. And so one by one, these relatives started falling out of this race. And so it was just the two-leggeds and the four-legged buffalo that were still in cahoots. They were still running together. And so neither one, they just kept looking at each other. Neither one would give up. And so finally, here comes the magpie. And the magpie came flying in, and he sat on Tatanka, on the buffalo's head. And he whispered into his ear, and he told them, he's like, let the two-legged win. If the two-legged win, then hopefully he will take care of all of us. And so this was an agreement that was actually made. And so the buffalo kept looking at the two-legged, to the man, and he's like, is this true? Or will you take care of us if I give up on this race? And the two-legged individual said, yes. He goes, from this time on, I will always look after you and become the caretaker of everything that exists. And so this was an agreement, once again, made by the relatives of the four-legged and the winged and the two-legged and the water relatives. And so understanding that, they gifted that power to the two-legged individuals. And so back in the day, our numbers, they numbered in the millions. There was millions and millions of buffaloes. There was millions of indigenous people residing on this land. And so from that time on, up until the 1900s, both of us almost disappeared. The indigenous people of this land, as well as all of the four-legged buffaloes. And so when they took the census in the 1890s, there was only 1,000 buffalo left in the United States. And so during this time, there was, only 200,000 indigenous people, Native American people, residing out of all the millions that used to live here. And so from that time on, our numbers were like a roller coaster. We were really high, and then boom, we almost plummeted, and we almost went extinct. And so we've always taken care of that buffalo. And so our numbers have always been the same. And so today, there is 3.5 million buffalo that exist in the United States today. And for the indigenous people, that is the same amount of people, Native American people, that exist in the United States. Our numbers are at 3.5 million. And so we've been on this journey for a long time together. And so we've always taken care of that buffalo and all of the relatives that exist. And so long ago, the United States government, they created different agencies to look over and oversee indigenous Native American affairs. And so they created an agency called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It's under the Department of the Interior. And so if you know the Department of the Interior, and if you fish or you hunt, this is where you get your hunting license from. And so this is where they place the indigenous peoples with all the wildlife, because way back in the day, we weren't considered human beings. And so this is a story that, I tell a lot of our adults, because, even the United States government didn't acknowledge indigenous people as human beings. And so that's why they placed us with all the wildlife. And that's where we still are today. And so Senator Holland was just named the director of the Department of the Interior. This is the first time that an indigenous person has held that position to oversee and to be the guardians of the Native American people of this land. So it's really important to understand how important that is, to have a lady from the Southwest understand, and being a part of the Pueblo Nation down south, of how important that truly is to all indigenous people. And so here's another story. And so long ago, there was these two ladies who were walking through the forest, walking through the Black Hills once again. And we call this place, it's a very special place that we call Hesapa. Hesapa is the hills that look black, because far away, when you're coming up close to the Black Hills, the hills look all black just because of that pine tree. And so there's a specific reason why that pine tree exists in the Black Hills. And so long ago, that pine tree complained all the time about everything. He didn't like kids climbing up onto the tree itself. He didn't like his leaves falling off of his branches. He didn't like the little kids pulling the fruit off of him and eating pieces of him. And so he complained to the Creator about everything. He didn't like the snow because he got too cold. He didn't like the wind because it messed up all of his leaves and blew the leaves off of his branches. And so, he just kept complaining and complaining all the time. And so the Creator finally took care of him and placed him up in the Black Hills so that he could live all by himself. And so when you go to the Black Hills, you don't see other trees. You only see that pine tree. And on the pine tree, the leaves never fall off because he doesn't have leaves. He has pine needles. And so nobody can eat the pine cones. And so that's what he gifted him. He gifted him the pine cones that nobody would want to pull off or use or eat. And so that's why we have the pine cones. And so when you look at the pine cones, you look at the pine needles, that never fall off. That tree is totally isolated by himself in the Black Hills. And so we often tell our own children, we're like, don't be like the pine tree. Don't complain about this or that, because you'll live in isolation. You'll live all by yourself. And so, that's just a way of being and an explanation of how to incorporate virtues and values into our ways of being. And so understanding the importance of the Black Hills, as Lakotas, we never lived in the Black Hills. We have 7 very sacred sites that we go and perform and partake in our rituals and our ceremonies. And this is how important the Black Hills are for us. It's a ceremonial grounds for us. And so we would never live there. We live at the base, and we hide from the high winds of the plains, and we hide into the valleys of the Black Hills, but never into the Black Hills. And so that's how important that is. And so once again, we have these 2 young ladies who were walking through the Black Hills. And so they were admiring all the Wichakwe Oyate. The Wichakwe is the Star Nation people. And so we know once again that we're star people. And so we believe that in our seventh stage of life, that our soul, our wanagi, goes back up into the skies. And so this is a common belief for most people all over the world, that our soul goes back up to the Creator, and understanding that next journey of traveling through that Milky Way. And so when the stars fall, this is how our soul comes back. And so all indigenous people, we all believe in reincarnation. And so when we see the stars falling, we know that somebody's coming back home again. And so understanding that, when these young ladies were walking through the forest, they were admiring the stars. And once again, they were looking and talking, to each other, and like, look how beautiful these stars are. We wish we could marry the stars. And then out of nowhere, these two guys popped out of the forest. They were hiding behind these trees. And so they introduced themselves to these young ladies. And quickly they fell in love with each other. And so the star people, the star guys, they were talking to these ladies, and they're like, well, we actually emerged from the skies. We're part of the Star Nation people. And we came down to marry you if you'd like to marry us and go back up into our world, into the star world. And so those young ladies were all happy. And so they took off up into the skies. And so understanding that they lived in the stars for a very, very long time. And so the only rule that exists up in the Star Nation was to never pull this plant that the Lakotas call Teamsula. Teamsula is the wild turnips. And so the wild turnips is really fuzzy. It's a plant that only grows at the end of May for only like 3 weeks out of the whole year. And it blooms this very beautiful purple flower. And so once that flower emerges, everybody in South Dakota, all over the plains, were all telling each other, Teamsulas are back. The Teamsulas are back. And so we all go out into the prairies and we start digging all these wild turnips. And we wash them, and we take care of them. We shuck them. We leave the roots in them, and we pull a dull knife through the blades of that through the root system. But we keep that root intact because we want to braid it. And so we have really long strands like garlic cloves, and we braid our wild turnips, and then we hang them up in our lodges. And it's a way to preserve the wild turnips. And so once again, the only rule that existed up in the star world was to never pull that wild turnip plant. And so one of these young ladies, she was getting really homesick. And so she looked at that Teamsula plant and she pulled it. And all of a sudden it opened up this huge hole in the skies. And so she looked down in through that hole and she could see her village. And so she got really homesick and she kept looking down into that hole, and she kept, stretching further down into it. And so all of a sudden she fell through that hole. And so when she fell through that hole, she was actually pregnant. So she barely made it through that hole. But then when she fell out of the sky, she hit the ground and boom, and the baby came flying out of her. And so that baby was part star and part human. And so he wasn't a normal baby. And he just grew and grew and grew into like a big giant. And so he became known as Wichakbe Hokshila, which is Starboy. And so Starboy became a hero of the plains. He protected the Lakota people. And any monsters that existed, he always took care of them. And so then that brings us to the story of the 7 little girls. And so when the 7 little girls were running through the forest, once again, this big old bear was chasing them. And so after that bear chased them down, the only way to get away from that bear was to pray to the Creator so that the Creator would take care of them. And that's when the ground started to shake underneath their feet. And so when the land, when the earth shook and that land formation came out of the ground, it was very tubular, kind of looked like a big tree, actually. And so all around this big rock formation, this tree, this is when this big old bear was trying to get to them. And so the bear was clawing into this rock formation. And when he was doing that, the girls were up on top of this butte, on top of this land formation, and they just kept going further and further up into the skies. And so they became known as Pleiades, But we, as the Lakotas, we acknowledge them as the 7 little girls who turned into the Big Dipper. And so, understanding that the only way to get rid of that bear was to call and scream for Starboy. And so, Starboy is the one that actually saved those little girls. And he came and he killed the bear. And so, the bear came falling out of the sky and boom, hit the ground. But by then, the little girls made their way all up into the skies and became known once again as the 7 little girls. And so stories like this have been passed down for many generations because we have a lot of the little ones always asking, Echela toku, taku, taku ho. Why? And so we have these stories that coincide with what exists outside and what we see. And so when you drive, into the Black Hills and you see this rock formation that is known today as Devil's Tower, the Lakota people way back in the day, we identified that as the gray horned owl that or the gray horn that sticks up out of the ground. And so that's how we acknowledge it. And the claw marks, once again, was created by the bear.